Liam had always been curious, perhaps a little too curious for his own good. He wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories or the supernatural. Those were things reserved for late-night campfires and horror films. To him, the world was a tangible place, ruled by logic and reason. But some nights, that logical world took on a different hue, and tonight, as the full moon hung heavy and bloated in the sky, it was one of those nights. He had been hiking earlier, trying to clear his head after a long, grueling week of classes and obligations. University life had its perks, but sometimes the pressures of deadlines and exams bore down on him like a weight. The nearby forest had always provided solace, its vastness and quiet offering a retreat from the noise of daily life. As the sun began to set, Liam found himself wandering deeper than usual, drawn by the fading light filtering through the trees. It was by pure chance, or perhaps something more sinister, that he stumbled upon it. Liam had been navigating the thick underbrush when he spotted an old, weathered fence peeking through the dense foliage. Its iron bars were twisted with age, rust clinging to them like barnacles. Beyond the fence, a small clearing opened up, bathed in the cold light of the rising moon. As he approached, the air grew still, unnaturally quiet. The usual sounds of nocturnal creatures, the chirping of crickets, the hooting of owls, faded into silence. A shiver ran down Liam's spine, but his feet carried him forward, his curiosity piqued. The cemetery lay before him, forgotten and forsaken, as though it had been swallowed by the forest centuries ago. Crumbling headstones jutted out from the ground like the broken teeth of some long-dead beast. Weeds and ivy twisted around the stones, obscuring the names of those buried beneath. A low mist clung to the earth, swirling lazily in the moonlight, giving the entire place an ethereal glow. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something old and rotting. Liam hesitated, feeling a sudden weight in his chest. This was no place for the living. He should turn back, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. After all, it was just an old cemetery, right? A relic of the past. What harm could there be in exploring it for a moment? As he crossed through the gate, a chill settled over him. The air inside the cemetery was colder, unnaturally so. He glanced back at the forest behind him, the towering trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. For a brief moment, he considered leaving, but something about the place held him captive, a strange, magnetic energy that made it impossible to turn away. Liam walked among the gravestones, brushing aside the overgrown vines and moss. Most of the markers were too worn to read, the inscriptions eroded by time. Yet, even in their decay, they seemed to whisper their stories, tales of lives long extinguished. His footsteps echoed softly in the stillness, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. But as he ventured deeper into the cemetery, that silence began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a rustling of leaves that could have easily been the wind. But there was no breeze. Then came the faintest sound, like the creak of ancient wood straining against time. He stopped, his heart pounding in his chest, and listened. There was again a low groan, as if the earth itself was breathing. Liam's pulse quickened, but still he pressed forward. The path wound deeper into the heart of the cemetery, where the headstones grew larger and more elaborate, the graves more pronounced. Some were marked with grand mausoleums, their doors sealed with iron bars, while others were sunken into the ground, half consumed by the earth. It was then that Liam noticed something odd. The ground beneath his feet felt soft. He glanced down and saw that the soil was freshly disturbed, as if it had been recently dug up. A cold dread began to creep over him, but before he could make sense of it, there was movement. The earth shifted, just a fraction, but enough to make him freeze in place. His breath caught in his throat. He watched in horror as the dirt began to bulge and ripple, like something was trying to claw its way out. At first, he thought it was his imagination, a trick of the moonlight. But then he saw it, skeletal fingers, pale and decayed, breaking through the surface. Liam stumbled back, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. And yet there it was, another hand, gnarled and skeletal, pushing through the dirt beside the first. He stared in disbelief as more and more hands emerged, clawing their way out of the earth, as if the graves were vomiting up their long-buried dead. Suddenly, the stillness of the night was shattered by a low, guttural moan. It came from all around him, rising like a chorus of the damned. The graves split open, and the dead began to rise. Liam's body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt like lead. He watched, paralyzed, as figures pulled themselves free from their resting places, their hollow eyes fixed on him with a terrible hunger. Some were nothing but bones, while others still wore the rotting remnants of the flesh they had once possessed. The air filled with the stench of decay, thick and suffocating. The cemetery was alive with the dead. In a surge of adrenaline, Liam turned and ran. His feet pounded against the soft earth, his heart racing in his chest. But no matter how fast he ran, the moans of the dead followed him, growing louder and more insistent. He could hear them now, the rustling of their decayed limbs, the crunch of bones beneath their feet as they lumbered after him. He reached the cemetery gates and threw himself against them, but the rusted iron bars held fast, as if something was keeping them locked. Panic surged through him. He looked back over his shoulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The dead were closing in, their rotting hands outstretched, their lifeless eyes locked on him. This wasn't just an old cemetery. It was a trap, a place where the dead refused to rest. And now, he was part of their nightmarish game. As the first bony hand grasped his arm, Liam screamed. But in the empty night, there was no one to hear. Liam's scream pierced the still air, but it was swallowed by the oppressive darkness that surrounded him. The cold grip of the skeletal hand tightened around his arm, the brittle bones digging into his flesh like jagged shards of ice. Panic surged through him, electrifying his senses. He pulled away with all his strength, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. The dead, relentless and unfeeling, continued their slow, methodical advance, their sunken eyes fixed on him with unnatural hunger. He wrenched himself free from the bony hand, stumbling backward toward the center of the cemetery, away from the locked gates. His breath came in shallow, frantic gasps as he glanced around, searching for any path of escape. But every direction was blocked by the dead, shambling, rotting figures that clawed their way out of their graves, their grotesque bodies illuminated by the sickly glow of the full moon. Liam's legs felt weak, his mind racing with disbelief and terror. This couldn't be happening. It defied every law of nature, every shred of logic he had ever known. But there they were, the risen dead, their decayed forms moving with terrifying purpose. He couldn't escape them. They were everywhere. He bolted, his instincts taking over. Dodging through the headstones and crumbling crypts, he tried to outmaneuver the horde. His legs burned, but he couldn't stop. He didn't dare. Every corner of the cemetery seemed to warp, the gravestones twisting in his vision, their engraved names blurring as though the very air was thick with some malevolent force. As he ran, something caught his eye in the far corner of the cemetery, a small, decrepit chapel, barely visible through the mist and shadows. Its windows were shattered, and its once grand stone walls were now crumbling, overrun with vines. The door, barely hanging on its rusted hinges, offered a sliver of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, it could provide a refuge. With no other options, Liam sprinted toward it, his heart pounding in his ears, drowning out the groans of the dead behind him. The ground shifted beneath him, the dirt soft and damp as though it had recently been disturbed. But he didn't care. The chapel loomed closer, its dark silhouette a beacon of salvation in the nightmare landscape. He reached the door and flung it open, the old wood creaking loudly in protest. Without looking back, he hurled himself inside and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed through the small space, the wood groaning as though it, too, was weary from holding back the horrors outside. Liam pressed his back against the door, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with terror. Inside, the chapel was a shell of its former self. The pews were broken, rotted from years of neglect. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung from the rafters like ghostly shrouds. The altar at the front, once a symbol of reverence and peace, was now cracked and stained with something dark, something that looked far too much like blood. Liam's eyes darted around the room, his mind still racing, but there was no immediate danger inside. He allowed himself a moment to breathe, to try and comprehend the madness that had engulfed him. His entire body trembled, his muscles aching from the adrenaline. What the hell was this place? What had he unleashed? A low groan from outside reminded him that he wasn't safe. The dead were still out there, and they would find him soon. He could hear them now, their moans growing louder, their slow, deliberate footsteps crunching over the broken earth. The undead were relentless, drawn to the chapel by some unseen force, perhaps the same force that had brought them back from their graves. Desperation clawed at Liam's thoughts. He couldn't just wait here and hope they would go away. There had to be something, anything, that could help him. His eyes scanned the chapel frantically, searching for a weapon, a hiding place, some kind of answer. But there was nothing, and then he saw it. Near the back of the chapel, half hidden beneath the crumbling remains of a pew, was a book. Its cover was tattered and worn, the leather cracked with age. But there was something about it, something that drew his gaze like a moth to a flame. He moved toward it, almost in a trance, his hand reaching out instinctively. The book seemed to hum with an energy, a dark power that thrummed through the air, making the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He picked it up carefully, his fingers brushing over the strange symbols etched into the cover. They were unlike anything he had ever seen before, ancient, arcane. As he opened the book, the pages crackled softly, yellowed with age. The writing inside was in a language he couldn't understand, the letters jagged and spidery, but the drawings, the illustrations, sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through him. The book was filled with depictions of rituals, dark ceremonies performed under the full moon, surrounded by the dead. He flipped through the pages, each more horrifying than the last. Sketches of rotting corpses, of hands reaching out from the earth, of blood rituals meant to summon something unspeakable. His pulse quickened as he reached the final pages, where a single drawing stretched across the parchment. It showed the cemetery, bathed in moonlight, with the dead rising from their graves. But what sent icy fingers of fear down Liam's spine was the figure at the center of the drawing. A man, standing alone, surrounded by the dead. The figure was unmistakable. It was him. A sharp knock at the chapel door jolted Liam from his shock. The dead were here. He could hear their ragged breaths, their decayed fingers scraping against the wood. The door shook under their weight, the ancient hinges groaning as they pressed against it. He backed away, clutching the book to his chest, his mind reeling with the realization that he had somehow become part of this nightmare. Another thud, louder this time, reverberated through the chapel. The door wouldn't hold much longer. Liam's eyes darted back to the book, to the pages that had been stained with blood. There had to be something in here, some way to stop this madness. But the words were incomprehensible, the language long forgotten. Panic clawed at him, and he could feel the weight of the dead pressing in on him from all sides. And then, as if guided by some unseen hand, his eyes fell upon a small section of the text that was circled in red ink. Unlike the rest of the book, the words here were written in English, scrawled hastily in the margin. To wake the dead is to call forth the curse. Only blood will return them to their graves. Liam's heart skipped a beat. Blood? His blood? The door rattled violently now, the wood splintering under the pressure. The dead were almost inside. He had to act and fast. With trembling hands, he set the book on the ground and frantically searched for anything sharp. A shard of glass, a piece of broken wood. His fingers closed around a jagged piece of stone from the broken altar. His mind screamed at him to stop, that this was insane, but the rising tide of moans outside silenced his fear. He raised the stone to his palm, the cold edge biting into his skin. With a swift motion, he slashed across his hand, the pain sharp and immediate. Blood welled up, dripping onto the floor, staining the pages of the book. The moment the blood hit the parchment, the room seemed to tremble, the air thickening with a tangible, oppressive energy. and then everything went still. The stillness that followed was so profound it felt as though the entire world had paused, holding its breath in anticipation. Liam stood frozen, his hand still bleeding onto the ancient book, the stone clutched tightly in his other hand. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had the blood stopped them? Were the dead retreating back to their graves? His hope was short-lived. A slow, deliberate creak filled the chapel as the door gave way, splintering inward under the relentless pressure. The wood cracked and groaned, and through the gap, Liam saw them, twisted, decayed faces with hollow eyes, staring at him with a hunger that made his stomach turn. Their fingers, some skeletal, some still covered in decaying flesh, clawed at the remnants of the door, tearing it apart piece by piece. Liam's heart hammered in his chest, and instinctively, he backed away from the advancing horde. The air inside the chapel felt thick, oppressive, like the walls were closing in around him. He could hear the ragged breathing of the undead as they pushed through the doorway, dragging their decrepit bodies inside. Their movements were slow but deliberate, purposeful, as if they knew exactly what they were after him. His eyes darted down to the book, to the blood that now smeared the pages. The crimson droplets seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if the ancient text had absorbed his offering, feeding on it. But nothing else had happened. The dead hadn't returned to their graves. If anything, they seemed more determined, more focused. Panic surged in Liam's chest. Had he misread the passage? Was there something else required? Some other ritual or incantation to complete the process? His thoughts spiraled as the first of the undead crossed the threshold of the chapel, its bony hands outstretched toward him. "No!" Liam cried out, backing away toward the altar. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help him. But the chapel was a tomb in its own right, offering no escape, no salvation. The undead staggered closer, their movements slow but relentless. Their moans filled the air, a chorus of despair and death. The stench of decay was overwhelming, thickening the air and making Liam's stomach churn. He could feel the coldness of their presence creeping toward him, like a chill that gnawed at his bones. With his back against the altar, Liam knew he was trapped. The dead were closing in, their twisted forms crowding the small space. He raised the stone again, desperate to defend himself, though he knew it would be futile. The undead were beyond pain, beyond fear. They were driven by something darker, something far more powerful than mere survival. And then, from the corner of his eye, Liam noticed something he hadn't seen before. Behind the altar, partially obscured by debris and shadows, was a trapdoor. It was small, barely large enough for a person to crawl through, and its wood was worn and splintered. But it was a way out, perhaps the only way out. Without thinking, he lunged toward it, his fingers scrambling to clear the debris away. He could hear the dead closing in behind him, their rattling breaths just inches from his skin. His heart pounded in his chest as he pulled at the trapdoor's handle. It gave way with a creak, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. The smell of damp stone and earth wafted up, mingling with the stench of decay that filled the chapel. There was no time to hesitate. Without a second thought, Liam threw himself into the darkness, pulling the trapdoor shut behind him just as a decaying hand reached for him. The darkness below was suffocating, and the air was damp and cold. Liam fumbled in the pitch black, his hands scraping against the rough stone walls of the staircase as he descended. His breaths came in ragged gasps, each step feeling like it dragged him deeper into the earth's cold embrace. The walls seemed to close in around him, pressing against his mind with an almost physical weight. He couldn't see where the stairs led, but he knew one thing. It had to be safer than facing the dead above. His foot slipped on the slick stones, sending him tumbling down the last few steps. He hit the ground with a painful thud, the air knocked from his lungs. For a moment, he lay there in the dark, disoriented and gasping for breath. The only sound was the slow drip of water echoing from somewhere deep within the subterranean passage. Liam forced himself to sit up, his head spinning. He was underground now, in some forgotten crypt or tunnel. The air was colder here, almost biting, and the walls were slick with moisture. His hands fumbled in the darkness until they brushed against something cold and metallic. A lantern. He lit it, the flame flickering weakly at first before growing stronger, casting long shadows across the stone walls. The light revealed what Liam had feared. He was in some sort of ancient burial chamber, deep beneath the cemetery. Rows of stone coffins lined the walls, their lids cracked and broken. Bones lay scattered across the floor, some still wrapped in the tattered remains of burial shrouds. The sight made his stomach lurch, but he had no time to dwell on it. The groans from above had faded, but Liam knew the dead wouldn't stop. They were relentless, bound to the curse that had been awakened by the full moon and his presence in the cemetery. And now, somehow, he had become the key to it all. As he moved further into the chamber, his lantern casting flickering light on the walls, Liam noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, carved into the stone walls, were the same symbols he had seen in the book. Dark, jagged runes that seemed to writhe and pulse in the dim light. The markings formed a circle, and at the center of the chamber stood a large stone altar, similar to the one in the chapel above, but far older and far more ominous. The book had mentioned rituals, ceremonies conducted under the full moon to raise the dead. But what had it said about stopping them? He couldn't remember clearly. The terror had clouded his mind. Liam approached the altar cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The stone was stained with ancient blood, darkened over centuries of ritual. As he circled it, he realized there was something else, something hidden beneath the altar's base. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt and debris until his fingers found it. A small, rusted box, its surface covered in the same strange runes. His hands shook as he pried the box open. Inside was a dagger, old and blackened with age, its blade etched with the same symbols as the book. Next to it, a piece of parchment crumpled and yellowed, with writing that was almost impossible to read. But one sentence stood out, scrawled in the same desperate hand as the one in the book's margin. Only the blood of the living can seal the curse. Only the willing sacrifice can return the dead to their rest. Liam's breath caught in his throat. The meaning was clear now. The dead would not rest unless a life was given in exchange for theirs. His blood, his life. The weight of the revelation crushed him. Was this his fate? To die here, beneath the earth, in some forgotten crypt, all because he had been too curious, too foolish? He looked at the dagger in his hand, its blade gleaming faintly in the lantern light. Could he really do it? Could he offer himself as a sacrifice to stop the horrors he had unleashed? His mind raced with the impossible choice before him. Above, he could hear the faintest echo of the dead, still searching, still hungering. And now they were waiting for him to decide. Liam stood frozen, his hand trembling as it hovered over the ancient dagger. The blade glinted ominously in the flickering lantern light, its jagged edge stained with the darkened remnants of countless lives sacrificed before him. The weight of the revelation hung in the air, as heavy and suffocating as the crypt that surrounded him. His blood, his life, was the key to stopping the nightmare that had been unleashed. But how could he possibly give up everything? How could he willingly offer himself to the same ancient curse that had drawn him into this twisted nightmare? The walls of the underground chamber seemed to close in around him, their cold, damp surfaces slick with centuries of decay. The symbols carved into the stone pulsated with a dark energy, as if the very air around him was alive with the curse. Liam's chest tightened as panic welled up inside him again. He could feel the weight of his own mortality pressing down on him, the finality of the decision he was about to make. But even as his mind raced, another sound began to rise from above, a scraping, shuffling noise, growing louder by the second. The dead were coming. They had found him. Liam's heart pounded in his chest as he staggered back from the altar, clutching the dagger tightly. He could hear them now, their bony fingers clawing at the trapdoor, their low, guttural moans echoing through the crypt like a dirge. The fear surged through him, overwhelming every rational thought. Could he really end this with a single act? Would his death stop the curse? Or was it just another lie in the web of ancient evil that had ensnared him? The pounding on the trapdoor grew louder. The wood splintered as the dead began to force their way through, their twisted, decayed faces just visible in the faint lantern light. Time was running out. Liam had no choice. His mind raced back to the book, to the hastily scrawled warnings and cryptic instructions. The blood of the living, his blood, was needed to end the curse. But there was something else in those pages, something buried beneath the terror and confusion that had gripped him. The phrase repeated in his head, "Only the willing sacrifice can return the dead to their rest." Willing. That single word struck him like a blow. This wasn't just about shedding blood. It wasn't about some simple ritualistic offering. The sacrifice had to be chosen, conscious. It had to be given freely. Liam looked at the dagger in his hand, and the gravity of the situation became clear. If he didn't willingly give himself to the curse, then all of this, the dead, the terror, the rising tide of horror, would continue. He would die anyway, torn apart by the ravenous dead, his life claimed by the curse. But if he chose to die, if he made that final, impossible decision, he could end it. He could stop the dead from ever rising again. His breath came in ragged gasps as the trapdoor burst open. The dead poured into the crypt like a flood of rot and bone, their bodies twisted and broken, their hollow eyes fixed on him with unnatural hunger. They stumbled forward, their arms outstretched, skeletal hands reaching for him. Liam's entire body trembled with fear, but something deeper stirred within him, a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. He stepped back toward the altar, his eyes flicking to the dagger again. His fate was sealed, one way or another. But maybe, just maybe, he could control it. As the first of the undead crossed the threshold into the crypt, Liam raised the dagger high, the cold steel glinting in the faint lantern light. The dead surged toward him, their moans rising to a deafening crescendo. Their faces, twisted and contorted by centuries of decay, seemed to mock him, as if daring him to act. He had no more time to think. With a final, desperate surge of determination, Liam drove the dagger into his chest. The blade sank deep, and for a moment, he felt nothing, just the cold metal sliding through flesh and bone. But then, a white-hot pain exploded through him, radiating out from the wound and consuming his entire body. He gasped, his breath catching in his throat as blood welled up from the wound and spilled onto the altar. The dead stopped. Every shambling figure in the crypt froze in place, their eyes still locked on him. But they didn't move. They didn't reach for him. They stood as still as statues, as if some invisible force had bound them in place. Liam's vision blurred as the pain overwhelmed him, his body growing weaker with each passing second. His blood pooled on the stone floor, seeping into the cracks and crevices of the ancient altar, mingling with the stains of those who had come before him. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to his knees, the dagger still buried in his chest. The crypt seemed to spin around him, the edges of his vision darkening. And then, in the silence, he heard it, a low, deep rumble, like the sound of the earth itself shifting. The walls of the crypt began to tremble, the stone vibrating beneath his hands. The symbols carved into the walls pulsed with a sickly red light, brighter and brighter until the entire chamber was bathed in its glow. The dead, still frozen in place, began to crumble. Their bones turned to dust before Liam's eyes, collapsing into heaps on the floor. One by one, they fell, their moans dying in their throats as their bodies disintegrated. The ground shook violently now, the altar cracking beneath the weight of the curse that had been lifted. Liam's vision dimmed, his strength ebbing away with each ragged breath. The pain in his chest was fading, replaced by a cold numbness that spread through his limbs. He knew his time was running out, but as the crypt began to collapse around him, Liam felt something else, a strange sense of peace. He had made the choice. He had taken control of his fate, and in doing so, had stopped the curse. The dead would return to their graves. The nightmare was over. With one final, shuddering breath, Liam slumped forward, his body growing cold as the life drained from him. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the light from the symbols fading away, leaving the crypt in silence once more. When Liam's eyes fluttered open, he was lying on the forest floor, the night sky stretching out above him. The full moon hung low on the horizon, its pale light casting long shadows across the trees. He blinked, disoriented, as he sat up, his hand instinctively reaching for his chest. But there was no wound, no blood. He was alive. Confusion washed over him as he looked around. The cemetery gate stood in the distance, but it was different now, silent, peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. The dead were gone. The ancient tombstones lay undisturbed, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. Had it all been a dream? A twisted hallucination? But as Liam rose to his feet, he felt the weight of the dagger still hanging from his belt, its ancient symbols etched into the blackened blade. And deep inside, he knew the truth. The curse had been real. The dead had risen, but he had stopped them. His sacrifice had broken the cycle, and the cemetery, once a place of horror, was now at rest. With a deep breath, Liam turned away from the cemetery and began walking, his steps slow and deliberate. The forest felt different now, calm, as if the dark energy that had once pulsed through the earth had finally been silenced. But as he disappeared into the trees, a single thought lingered in his mind. Some secrets should never be disturbed, and some curses, once broken, leave behind scars that never truly heal. And though the dead now slept, Liam would never forget the price he had paid to make sure they stayed buried. For weeks after that night, Liam could still feel the weight of the crypt and its dark secrets pressing on him, even as life around him returned to its normal rhythms. He resumed his classes, tried to focus on studying, but there was no escaping the haunting memories of the night the dead had risen. He often found himself distracted, staring blankly out of windows or drifting into uneasy sleep, only to wake in a cold sweat, the sound of the dead's moans still echoing in his ears. Despite the relief of surviving, something deep inside gnawed at him. He was supposed to be dead. He had plunged the dagger into his chest, felt the cold steel pierce his flesh. His blood had soaked the altar, and yet here he was, walking the same paths, eating, breathing, alive. But for how long? Late at night, when the world around him was quiet, Liam would take the dagger from its hidden place under his bed and run his fingers over the ancient symbols carved into the blade. The runes still pulsed faintly under his touch, as if the blade itself held a residue of the curse. He couldn't shake the feeling that something unfinished lingered, that the cemetery's hold over him hadn't truly released its grip. On one such night, while the moon was beginning to wax toward fullness once more, Liam lay in bed, unable to sleep. His apartment felt suffocating, the walls closing in, his breath shallow. His gaze flicked again to the dagger, as it had done so many times. But tonight, something was different. The air in the room felt heavy, as though the very atmosphere had thickened with some unseen weight. A cold wind slipped through the cracks in the window, despite it being closed. Liam sat up abruptly, his pulse quickening. The air in the room grew colder still, and the familiar, faint moan of the dead began to creep into his ears. His heart raced. This wasn't just his imagination. The sound was real. With shaking hands, he grabbed the dagger, clutching it tightly as if it might somehow protect him. His eyes scanned the room, half expecting the walls to fall away, revealing the crypt beneath his feet once more. But the apartment remained the same. Only the sound of the dead, their whispers growing louder, had changed. It was as though they were calling to him, beckoning him back to the cemetery. A chill ran down his spine as he realized something else, something far worse. The full moon was only a few days away. Panic surged in his chest. The cemetery had claimed him that night, and even though he had escaped, the bond hadn't been broken. It hadn't ended with the sacrifice. Liam could feel it in his bones, in his blood. Whatever force had pulled him into that cursed place, whatever had risen the dead, was still there. And it was coming for him. In a daze, Liam threw on his jacket, grabbed the dagger, and bolted out of his apartment. He had no clear plan, no real idea of what he would do, but one thing was certain. He had to return to the cemetery. He needed answers, and maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to sever the cursed connection before it was too late. The night air was cold, as he sped down the darkened streets. The forest loomed ahead, its silhouette a menacing black mass under the pale light of the moon. The closer he got, the stronger the pull became. It was as though the cemetery itself was calling him, a dark voice whispering in his mind, promising terrible truths that lay buried beneath the earth. The path he had taken weeks ago wound its way through the thick trees, and as Liam followed it, dread gnawed at his gut. Each step felt heavier than the last, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel it now, an unnatural force, thick in the air, growing stronger with every moment. The dead were not at rest. He had only postponed their return. When Liam finally reached the cemetery gates, the wind picked up, howling through the iron bars as though welcoming him back. The gate, rusted and twisted with age, creaked open on its own, as if the cemetery had been waiting for him all along. His feet carried him forward, past the crumbling headstones and the dark crypts, back toward the chapel that had almost claimed his life. But as he approached, he saw something he hadn't expected. The ground was undisturbed, the grave sealed, and there was no sign of the chaos that had unfolded that night. No skeletal hands reaching out from the earth, no torn-up soil. It was as though the cemetery had simply reverted to what it had been, a forgotten resting place for the dead. Yet the energy in the air, that palpable, electric sense of malevolence, remained. Liam made his way to the chapel, the dagger clutched tightly in his hand. The small structure stood in the moonlight, its broken windows like hollow eyes watching him approach. Inside, the chapel was exactly as he had left it. The altar cracked and crumbling, the dust undisturbed. But the trapdoor that had led to the crypt below was gone, as if it had never existed. A surge of frustration and fear gripped him. What was this place? How had he survived that night if the crypt no longer existed? Was this all some elaborate illusion? Or was the cemetery itself alive, playing tricks on his mind? A faint noise from behind him made Liam whirl around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing among the gravestones was a figure, a man, tall and shrouded in darkness, his face hidden in the shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Liam could feel its gaze burning into him, cold and accusatory. "Who are you?" Liam's voice was hoarse, the words barely escaping his dry throat. The figure said nothing, but its presence grew heavier, more oppressive. Then, from the shadows, the man finally spoke, his voice a rasp that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "You are bound, as they are bound. The dead are never truly silent." Liam's blood ran cold. The figure's words echoed in his mind, bringing with them the realization he had feared all along. The sacrifice had been incomplete. By some cruel twist of fate, his life had been spared, but the bond remained. The curse hadn't ended. It had merely changed. "You will never escape this place," the figure whispered, stepping forward. As the man emerged from the shadows, Liam saw the truth. The figure's face was his own, pale and drawn, eyes sunken and hollow, as though Liam were staring into a mirror that showed him the fate he could not outrun. Liam staggered back, his mind reeling. He dropped the dagger, its clatter echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The man, his doppelganger, smiled, a cold, joyless expression that chilled Liam to his core. "You were meant to join them," the figure continued, its voice a low growl. "And you will. In time." The ground beneath Liam's feet began to tremble, the graves around him shuddering, as if something deep beneath the earth was stirring once more. The dead were waking, and this time, there would be no escape. The figure stepped closer, raising a hand toward Liam. And as it did, Liam felt the same icy chill creeping through his body, the same cold hand of death that had nearly claimed him before. His skin tingled with the sensation of something pulling him down into the earth. But even as the darkness threatened to consume him, Liam fought back, clawing at the last shreds of hope he had left. He reached for the dagger, his hand shaking as he grasped its hilt. The figure paused, its cold eyes watching Liam with an unsettling calm. "You cannot fight it," the man said, his voice no longer human, but a chorus of whispers. "The dead will have you." With a final, desperate cry, Liam raised the dagger, and drove it into the earth at his feet, slamming it down with every ounce of strength he had left. The ground beneath him trembled violently, and a deafening roar filled the air as the cemetery seemed to split open. The figure vanished in a swirl of dust and shadow, its mocking laugh echoing into the night. Liam collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the wind howled around him. For a moment, everything was silent. The oppressive weight lifted. The dead, it seemed, had returned to their graves once more. But as Liam lay there, staring up at the full moon, he knew the truth. The dead were never truly gone. They were only waiting, and so was he.